There were some Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said there were 12 gods. We know of Christian groups that maintained in the 2nd and 3rd century that there were 30 gods. We know of one group that insisted, it's not going to clarify a thing I say. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said there were 365 gods. They called themselves Christian? Yes, they called themselves Christian. And they said that they represented the teachings of Jesus himself. They thought, though, they believed the right thing. Well, why didn't they just read their New Testaments to realize that it wasn't so? The short answer, as it appears you know, is that there was no New Testament. I've already talked with several of you before we started up here, and I was actually, a couple of people asked me about this phenomenon of courses on tape that I've done. Are you all familiar with the Teaching Company? Y'all know what that is? They do courses on all sorts of things: music appreciation, astronomy, philosophy, history, religious studies, and I've done a couple of these courses for them. And when people were asking me about these courses just now, it just reminded me how different it is giving these courses on tape from doing this. Because in fact, when you give these courses on tape, it seems like you're talking to an audience like this, right? Has anybody seen these videos of these courses? They kind of pan the crowd, you know, and the professor's up there gesticulating and, you know, looking at people and things and going around. But in fact, it doesn't work that way. When you do these courses on tape, you're actually in a TV studio, and there are two cameramen in there, kind of like this, only they're the only two people in the studio. And the other thing that's in the studio is a bright red digital clock that starts at 30:00, and your lecture is supposed to be 30 minutes long. So the cameraman has his headphones on. He's talking to the director outside, and the director says, okay, start. The cameraman points at you, and the clock starts ticking. And you're supposed to finish when it hits 0:00. And if you realize that you're 5 minutes short of material, you can't stop and say, okay, are there any questions? There's nobody in there. And so, and what I always do, which I'm sure to do tonight as well, what I always do is I get about 2 minutes into one of these talks, and I think, oh no, I don't have enough material. And so I start telling stories. And so I try to pack, just kind of pack it in a little bit. And then I get 5 minutes left. I realize, oh no, I've got 10 minutes worth of material here. And so then I rush to the end. So I'll try not to do that tonight. This lecture is called Lost Christianities, the Battles for Scripture and the Faiths We Never Knew. I did one of these courses on tape on this topic. I did 24 30-minute lectures on this, and you're getting all 24 lectures here in 1 hour. So, so you don't need to buy it. You're going to get it all here. You just get all the good stuff here, and you won't have to worry about any of the fluff that got put into the lectures. I want to begin by talking about some modern archaeological discoveries that are significant for the understanding of early Christianity. Or perhaps it would be better to say that these discoveries are important for the understanding of early Christianities. Because Christianity was so diverse in the early centuries that scholars have began to talk about it in pluralistic terms, that it's Christianities rather than just Christianity, because it is such a diverse movement. But I want to begin by saying something about some archaeological discoveries that have assisted us in understanding the great diversity of early Christianity. And I'm going to talk about just one, the most significant archaeological discovery for early Christianity. It took place in 1945. It was a year and a half before they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So everybody's heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered in 1947 in what is now Israel. The discovery I'm talking about happened a year and a half earlier in 1947, and didn't happen in Israel, it happened in Egypt. In Upper Egypt, near a village that's called Nag Hammadi, there were 7 field hands who were out digging for fertilizer near a cliff face near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in December 1947. The head of this group of 7, the chief guy, was a person who was named, memorably enough, Muhammad Ali. Unrelated to our Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali and a couple of his brothers and some friends were out digging for fertilizer, and Muhammad Ali's brother's mattock hit the ground, and it hit something hard underneath the ground, and they dug it out, and it turned out it was an earthenware jar that had a bowl over the top that was sealed. They were afraid to open up this jar because they thought there might be an evil genie inside. On further reflection, they realized there might be gold inside. And so they smashed it to smithereens. But inside there wasn't gold or a genie. Inside there were simply a group of leather-bound books, 13 books, bound in leather. This discovery took a long time for scholars to find out about for a variety of reasons. It's actually a complicated story. Muhammad Ali took these books back home with him. None of these people could read. They were 7 illiterate Bedouin who couldn't read. So they weren't sure what they were going to do with these books. But Muhammad Ali took them back, deposited them in an outbuilding back behind his house. Apparently that night his mother took some of the papyrus leaves and used them to start the evening fire. But I guess Muhammad Ali asked her not to do that anymore, luckily, and began to think maybe these books might be worth something. Maybe he could sell them. Now, there's a little kind of twist that happens in the story at this point. As it turns out, Muhammad Ali and his family were involved in a blood feud. His father had recently been murdered, and they knew the family that was responsible for the murder of the father. And a few weeks after the discovery of these scrolls, somebody told them that the fellow who had murdered their father was sitting by the side of the road. And so Muhammad Ali and his brothers got their mattocks, and they went out after this guy. They found him asleep next to a jar of molasses, apparently that he was selling, and they hacked the guy to death in cold blood, ripped open his chest, took out his heart, and ate it as an act of blood vengeance. Now, the downside of the story, one of the downsides of the story is that this guy they murdered was related to the local sheriff. So they knew there was going to be a big police investigation, and they were the obvious targets for this murder investigation. And Muhammad Ali, by this time, had decided that these documents that he had, these books, might really be worth something, and maybe they could make some money for them. So he gave the books over to a local priest for safekeeping, thinking that the authorities would be searching his house for clues about the murder, and he didn't want them to find these books and confiscate them. And so he gave them over to this priest, the local priest, to keep them. Now, the priest, I'm sorry, this gets a little complicated, but so it goes. The priest had a brother-in-law.
The modern New Testament was not fixed by Jesus or his disciples. In the 4th century, Christian leaders still disputed books such as James, Jude, 2 Peter, and Revelation. Athanasius did not list today's exact 27 books until 367. Codex Sinaiticus even included the Shepherd of Hermas and the Letter of Barnabas. Christianity calls its Bible divinely guided, but history shows church leaders arguing, choosing, and rejecting books for centuries.
Who was a traveling history teacher. And the brother-in-law was staying with the priest, and the priest showed him one of these books, and the brother-in-law realized this might be an ancient book. This, in fact, might get some money on the black market. So he takes it into Cairo and tries to sell it. Well, the authorities learn about it, and they confiscate the book, and there ends up being a complicated set of negotiations. He actually gets paid something for the book, and the book ends up in the Coptic Museum of Cairo, and eventually all 13 books are gathered together. They end up in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where eventually, after a couple of years, scholars find out about these books. Scholars go look at these books, and it turns out these books are very important indeed. The books, the leather-bound books themselves, scholars eventually determined are from the 4th century, the 4th Christian century, about 300 years after the death of Jesus. The way they know that these books date from the 4th Christian century is that the spines of the book, the spines of the book were strengthened with scrap paper. And some of the scrap paper included dated receipts. You know, like a pound of hamburger, a loaf of bread, April 3rd, 346, you know, that kind of thing. So there were dated receipts that were dated to the middle of the 4th century. So these books were manufactured in the middle of the 4th century or so. But the date of the manufacture of the books doesn't tell you when the documents within the books were written. There are 52 different documents within these 14 books. In other words, these books are anthologies of texts. The books were manufactured in the 4th century. The books inside them must have been composed at an earlier date, just as this book here in my hand was actually manufactured in the year 2003, but the documents in it were written 2,000 years ago. Okay, you see what I mean? These Nag Hammadi books were manufactured in the 4th century, but some of the documents in them were much older. Well, how much older were they? Some of these books we know about by name by church fathers living in the 2nd century. Some scholars think that some of these books were actually written in the 1st century. In other words, some of these books may be as old as books as we have in the New Testament. That's significant because these books in the Nag Hammadi library are books that stand at odds theologically with the books that made it into the New Testament. These books are books that were written by and for a group of heretical Christians, Christians who taught false teachings, who were called Gnostics. I'll be talking about what Gnostics believed in a few minutes. At this point, I simply want to point out that here we had, for the first time, an entire collection, sometimes this is called an entire library, of books written by the kinds of Christians who ended up losing the battles for dominance in early Christianity. These were the outsiders who taught beliefs that others said were false. Of course, the people who were teaching these beliefs didn't believe that these beliefs were false. In other words, these people are called heretics. What's a heretic? Well, a heretic is somebody who chooses. Chooses what? Well, you put the term heresy over against another term, orthodoxy. The term orthodoxy means right belief. What is a heretic? The word heretic comes from the Greek word choice, which means you choose what? You choose to believe something that's not the right beliefs. So you get the orthodox people who believe the right beliefs and the heretics who believe the wrong beliefs. But you've got to realize that everybody thinks they believe the right beliefs. Nobody thinks they believe the wrong beliefs, because if they thought they believed the wrong beliefs, they'd start believing the right beliefs. So that everybody thinks that they are orthodox by definition. Or as some people say, orthodoxy is my doxy and heterodoxy is your doxy. These heterodox or heretical documents show us a community of Christians who believe things that were quite different from what the believers who made our creed, such as the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, such as those believers believe, who gave us our canon of Scripture, who gave us the church that came down through the Middle Ages, through the Reformation down to today. These were believers who had other ideas. And what's striking is they claimed that their ideas were the ideas that were taught by Jesus' own apostles and by Jesus himself. Among these books found in the Nag Hammadi library are other gospels. A gospel allegedly written by Philip, Jesus' disciple. A gospel allegedly written by Judas Thomas, Didymus Judas Thomas, Jesus' own brother. A gospel called the Gospel of Truth, and a variety of other books found here that claim to be authorized by Jesus' own apostles. This discovery of the Nag Hammadi library showed us that early Christianity was extremely diverse. Let me say something in general terms about the diversity of early Christianity. Can you read this, by the way? From where I'm standing, it's rather fuzzy. Kind of like the rest of this talk. The diversity of early Christianity. Christianity today, of course, is extremely diverse. If you count everybody who calls themselves Christian in the mix, we have a wide range of belief and practice in Christianity today. You can contrast what Episcopalian priests think with what Appalachian snake handlers think. Contrast Roman Catholic nuns with Mormon missionaries, Seventh-day Adventists with Southern Baptists, all sorts of wide-ranging beliefs and practices. But the beliefs and practices of Christianity today pale in comparison with the diversity that you can find in the early Christian centuries, as we now know, because of archaeological discoveries and recent historical scholarship. Let me just talk about this diversity first in broad terms. In terms of theology, there were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century, so from about 100 years to 200 years after Jesus, there were Christians who believed that there's only one God, just as Christians today believe there's only one God. There were other people, though, who called themselves Christian who said that there were two gods. There were some Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said there were 12 gods. We know of Christian groups that maintained in the 2nd and 3rd century that there were 30 gods. We know of one group that insisted it's not going to clarify a thing I say. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said there were 365 gods. They called themselves Christian? Yes, they called themselves Christian, and they said that they represented the teachings of Jesus himself.
Christian orthodoxy won through political power, not better evidence. Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 to force unity inside a divided church. In 380, Emperor Theodosius ordered his subjects to follow Nicene Christianity and treated rival Christians as heretics. Later laws removed their privileges and imposed fines. The so-called true faith survived because emperors protected it and punished competing beliefs. Winning by law does not make a religion true.
There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century who said that this world was created by the one true God. There were other Christians who said this world was a cosmic mistake. There were others who said that this world was created by an evil deity, that the material world we live in is evil itself. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said that the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, were the Word of God given by the one God in control of all things. There were others who said that the Jewish Scriptures were inspired by a false God, and they are not to be accepted as scriptural authorities. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who said that Christ was both human and divine. He's both God and man. There were other Christians who said Jesus was completely God, and since he was completely God, he's not a man. God can't be a man any more than man can be a rock. They're two different things. There were other people who said that Jesus was a man, but he's not a God. There were other people who said that Jesus Christ was two things. He was a man, Jesus, and he had a divine element, the Christ. Two separate things. Jesus is one thing, Christ is a different thing. They came together temporarily during Jesus' public ministry. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century who said that Jesus' death was a death that brought about salvation from sins. There were other Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century who said Jesus' death had nothing to do with salvation from sin. There were other Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century who said Jesus never died. How could these groups be Christian? They claim to be Christian. Well, maybe their claim is false. Maybe they were just a bunch of heretics who believed the wrong thing. They thought, though, they believed the right thing. Well, why didn't they just read their New Testaments to realize that it wasn't so? The short answer as it appears you know, is that there was no New Testament. There was no New Testament. I'm not saying that the books of the New Testament had not been written yet. The books had been written. But Christians did not agree on what books should be accepted as scriptural authorities. Should we accept the Gospel of John? Should we accept the Gospel of Philip? What about the Gospel of Truth? What about the Gospel of Matthew? What about the Gospel of Thomas? What about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene? All of these are books claiming to be written by apostles of Jesus. And how do you know that the books in your New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, actually are apostolic books, where Thomas, Philip, Truth, and Mary are not apostolic books? How do you know that? Just because you can go to the bookstore and buy these things, and you buy a Bible and it has those 4 books in it? Who decided those 4 books should be in it? And how do you know that they were right? Christianity was extremely diverse, and that diversity created conflict in early Christianity as one group competed with another for converts. Only one of the groups ended up becoming victorious, and that victorious group decided for all time what Christian creeds would be recited, what the Christian churches would be like, and what the Christian New Testament would contain. I'm going to give now some more detail about some of these forms of Christianity that ended up losing out. Lost Christianities, beliefs, and authorities. I've been speaking in kind of general terms at this point. Now I want to talk specifically about 3 Christian groups. 3 Christian groups that we know about from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and just kind of flesh this out a little bit so you get some idea of what specifically some of these groups believed. And then I'm going to talk about the victorious party, the party that ended up becoming dominant, calling itself Orthodox, and then deciding which books belonged in the New Testament. By the way, I should point out, I'm not saying that the group that won is wrong, and I'm not saying they were right. I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just doing this as a historian, saying what happened in early Christianity. All right, so lost Christianities, beliefs, and authorities. I want to start with a group that historians have called the Ebionites. Just to give you an idea of what one Christian group thought, I'll start with this group called the Ebionites, and calling these the Christians who would also be Jews. We don't know why this group was called the Ebionites. The word Ebionite probably comes from the Hebrew word evion, which means poor. Now, the opponents of the Ebionites said that they were called the poor because they were poor in faith, which is probably not why the Ebionites themselves thought they called themselves the Ebionites. It may be that these Ebionites followed the practice of Jesus and his disciples of voluntary poverty, of giving away all their goods for the sake of the poor, giving up their own possessions for the sake of others. That may be why they're called the Ebionites. We're not really sure. What we are sure about is that these Ebionites were Jewish Christians. They were Christians who were themselves either Jews or converts to Judaism, who maintained that in order to be a follower of Jesus, you had to be Jewish. Their logic was Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, so that if you're going to be a follower of the Jewish Messiah, you have to be Jewish. It's a Jewish religion. And so these people were culturally and religiously Jewish. They kept the Sabbath, they circumcised their baby boys, they kept kosher food laws, they prayed facing Jerusalem, they engaged in Jewish kinds of activities. These Ebionites, since they were so ardently Jewish, were very strict monotheists. They believed that there's only one God. As a consequence, they did not believe that Jesus was God. Their logic was, if Jesus is God and God is God, you've got 2 gods. You don't have one God, you've got 2 gods. And so they maintained that if you're going to be a monotheist, you can't say that Jesus is also God. Well, who is Jesus then? Jesus, for these Ebionites, was a very righteous man. In fact, more righteous than anyone else. He was not somebody who came into the world from a previous divine existence. He was not born of a virgin. He was a man who was born to the sexual union of Joseph and Mary, born in the way everybody else is born, grew up righteous, and when he was an adult, he got baptized by John the Baptist. And when he got baptized, the heavens split up, the Spirit descended upon Jesus, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." At his baptism, Jesus was adopted to be the Son of God. God had a mission for this most righteous of men. It was to die for the sake of others. Jesus then taught the crowds. He did miraculous deeds by God's power. And at the end of his life, he fulfilled the mission God had given him by dying on the cross.
The Bible's most important stories were not preserved as cleanly as churches claim. The four Gospels never identify their authors inside the texts. Their familiar names came from later Christian tradition. One of the oldest surviving Bibles ends Mark at chapter 16, verse 8. The later verses describing appearances, snake handling, and poison were added afterward. A perfect message from God should not need church leaders and later copyists to provide names and complete its ending.
God then raised him from the dead as a reward for his faithfulness and exalted him to his right hand up in heaven. Jesus himself was not born of a virgin. He was not divine. He was a human, although he was very righteous. He was the Son of God, the one chosen by God to be his son. Now, how did these Ebionites come up with this idea? Well, they claimed that this point of view was the point of view that the earliest disciples of Jesus had. In fact, they claimed that their leader for their church originally was none other than James, the brother of Jesus, and that their teachings about Jesus came directly from James. Moreover, they had a written authority that supported their point of view. It was a gospel that looked a lot like our gospel of Matthew. This gospel that the Ebionites used looked a lot like our Matthew. Some of you may know that the gospel of Matthew in the New Testament is often thought of as the most Jewish of the gospels. In the gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells his followers that they have to keep the law even better than the scribes and Pharisees. They have to keep the Jewish law even better than the scribes and Pharisees. That not the least bit of the law will pass away before all is fulfilled, and that anyone who teaches somebody not to keep the law will be least in the kingdom of heaven, but those who keep these laws and teach others likewise will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Don't think that I came to abolish the law, says Jesus. I came to fulfill the law in Matthew. The Ebionites had some form of Matthew's gospel, but without chapters 1 and 2. For those of you who know your New Testaments very well, you'll know why they didn't have Matthew chapters 1 and 2. It's because those are the chapters that talk about Jesus' virgin birth. So they had a form of Matthew without chapters 1 and 2. It's probably a form of Matthew without that was actually written in Aramaic rather than in Greek, which is the language of Matthew. You know, some of you are looking tired, so I'm going to tell you an anecdote. I teach a New Testament class every year at Chapel Hill, and I start off every year by giving a pop quiz the first day of class. Yeah, I hand out a syllabus, then I give a pop quiz, and it's got 11 questions on it, and I tell my students that if anybody gets 9 out of the 11 right, I'll buy them dinner at the Armadillo Grill. I've got 360 students in there. I didn't buy a single dinner this year. These are not difficult questions. They're things like, you know, what are the 4 Gospels of the New Testament? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I do ask them, I start off by saying, how many books are in the New Testament? Well, they don't know. It's actually an easy answer. It's 27, which is easy because it's 3 to the 3rd power. See, Trinity, 3 times 3 times 3, 27. So it's easy to remember that. So, but then my next question is, in what language were they written? You know what half of my students think? Hebrew. Hebrew, yeah. Some of them think Latin. About 1/3 of them think English. No, that's not true. I made that up. 3 or 4 of them usually do, but that's another story. All right. Sorry, that was just a tangent to wake you up. So the Ebionites have this Aramaic gospel rather than a Greek gospel. Second group, Christians who proclaim the second God, the Marcionites. The Marcionites were around at the same time the Ebionites were. We know why the Marcionites were called Marcionites. It's because they were followers of a theologian philosopher of the 2nd century named Marcion, a very important figure in the history of 2nd century Christianity. Marcion understood Marcion understood earliest Christianity in light of the teachings of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, more than anybody, insisted that to be a Christian, you don't have to first become a Jew. Okay? As you can imagine, the Ebionites didn't like the Apostle Paul. The Ebionites thought Paul was a heretic. Marcion thought that Paul was the greatest, was the one who knew the truth. Paul differentiated between the law of the Jews on the one hand and the gospel on the other. Paul insisted that a person is made right with God by faith in Christ apart from doing works of the Jewish law. Marcion took this teaching of Paul, which you can still find in the letters of Paul in the New Testament, such as the book of Galatians. Marcion took this teaching of Paul and took it to an extreme. You've got the law of the Jews on the one hand and the gospel of Christ on the other. Marcion insisted that this dichotomy was absolute. The reason there's a difference between the law of the Jews and the gospel of Christ is because there are 2 different gods behind the law and the gospel. The Old Testament God is not the God of Jesus. Marcion wrote a book called the Antitheses, which means the contrary statements, in which he tried to prove that the Old Testament God could not be the God of Jesus, and he had a number of proofs that continue to sound convincing to some people today. What does the Old Testament God tell the children of Israel to do when they're to take the promised land? Remember the story about the city of Jericho? Joshua was supposed to lead the children of Israel around the city once a day for 7 days. On the 7th day, they go around 7 times. And on the 7th, when they go around the 7th time, the walls all fall down, and God tells them what to do. Go into the city and kill every man, woman, and child in the city. Kill every man. That's what God tells them to do? Yes, that's what the God of the Old Testament says. What does the God of the New Testament say? The God of the New Testament says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. If somebody strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Are you telling me this is the same God? It doesn't sound like the same God. In the Old Testament, the prophet Elisha is walking along, and there's a group of boys who start making fun of him, making fun of him because he's going bald. So they call out, "Baldy, Baldy." Well, Elisha did what any of the rest of us would do. He called the wrath of God down upon them.
The New Testament records a power struggle over Christianity's basic rules. In Galatians 2, Paul says he confronted Peter publicly over eating with non-Jews. Acts 15 shows church leaders fighting over circumcision. Matthew's Jesus says the Jewish law will remain, while Paul treats it as a temporary guardian. These are not minor details. They concern who can belong and how salvation works. The evidence looks like human factions building a religion, not one clear message from God.
But in this case, what happened is 2 she-bears then come out of the woods and maul and kill 42 children. Is this the same God who says, "Let the little children come unto me"? It doesn't sound like the same God. Marcion went through the Old Testament and showed time after time again that the things said about God in the Old Testament don't correspond with things said about God in the gospel of Jesus. Jesus' God is a God of love and mercy. The God of the Old Testament is a God of hate and wrath. Marcion concluded that the Old Testament God is the God who created this world. It says in Genesis he created this world. This world belongs to this other God. He created this world. He called Israel to be his people. He gave his people the law. The problem is nobody can keep that law. And since they don't keep it, they get a just penalty, which is they have to die. Everybody, therefore, has to die because they break the law of the just God. But there's another God, a God of love and mercy who has come into this world to save us from the wrathful God of the Jews. He comes in the person of Jesus. Jesus represents this other God. Since he represents this other God, the God who did not create the world, Jesus cannot be a part of this creation, which means he cannot have a material body, which means Jesus could not have been born in the normal way. According to Marcion, Jesus didn't really have flesh and blood. He descended from heaven in an adult form, and he only appeared to have flesh and blood. He only seemed to be human, but he wasn't really human. He was divine. Because if he were human, he'd belong to the other God, but he came to save people from that God. He came from the true God. Jesus then goes through his ministry, and he apparently dies on the cross, which is the penalty that the Old Testament God requires. And so the Old Testament God then releases anybody who has faith in Jesus from the demand of death. Jesus brings salvation then. Marcion then had a view that Jesus was God, but he wasn't human. It's fairly easy to differentiate Marcion's two gods based on the distinctions found in the Old Testament and in the writings of the New Testament. Well, did Marcion have the writings of the New Testament? Yes and no. Marcion had certain books that he claimed were sacred authorities. In particular, he had the writings of the Apostle Paul, who was his hero. He had all of Paul's letters that we have in the New Testament, except for 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. He had the other 10 letters. And Paul talks about his gospel. What is his gospel? Well, for Marcion, Paul's gospel was an actual gospel book that looked very much like what we have in our Gospel of Luke. Luke's gospel was the gospel of Marcion. So he had Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. In other words, and he didn't have any of the Old Testament. None of that was part of his canon. So he had an 11-book canon. So it's fairly easy to distinguish between the Ebionites on the one hand and Marcion on the other hand. The Ebionites are Jews who try to keep the Jewish law. Marcionites are against everything Jewish. The Ebionites have the Hebrew scriptures. The Marcionites reject the Jewish scriptures. The Ebionites maintain that there's only one God. Marcion maintains that there are two gods. The Ebionites say that Jesus is fully man, but he's not divine. The Marcionites say he's fully divine, but he's not man. For the Ebionites, Paul is a heretic. For the Marcionites, Paul is the greatest apostle. For the Ebionites, they have the Gospel of Matthew. The Marcionites have the Gospel of Luke. They're just as different as you can imagine, right down the line. And they both claimed to represent true Christianity. Marcion had huge success. The Ebionites, frankly, didn't have huge success in converting people for a reason that you might imagine. In order to convert, the men had to get circumcised, and so they weren't really lining up for the operation. Marcion, on the other hand, Marcion had huge success, established churches throughout Asia Minor, what is a modern-day Turkey, in Rome, and various places. In some places, there were more Marcionite Christians than any other kind of Christian in the 2nd century. And Marcionite Christianity continues on today. Because, I saw some people nodding their heads when I was saying that the Old Testament God is a God of wrath and the New Testament God is a God of love. Some of you are saying, yeah. Well, okay, that's Marcion. So, heresies are still among us today. And some of you are suspect. I want to talk about a third group now, Christians in the know. A group called the Gnostics. It is exceedingly difficult to summarize what the Gnostics stood for in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis, gnosis. That's a bad habit spelling. It's just because I teach. And usually students want to know if it's on the final exam. So sorry, it happens sometimes. So, okay, it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. Why are these people called Gnostics? Because they're the ones who know. They have gnosis. They have knowledge. Well, what do they know? What knowledge do they have? Gnostics know who they really are. They know who they are, where they came from, how they got here, and how they can escape. That was pretty good. I'm going to do that again. They know who they are, how they got here, where they came from, and how they can escape. They have self-knowledge, a knowledge that can bring salvation from this evil material world. Gnostics maintain that this world we live in was not created by the one true God. It was created as a cosmic mistake. This material world is itself evil, created not by the true God, but by evil deities, in order to trap an element of the divine here. An offshoot from the divine realm created this world. This offshoot is a false God, or an unjust God, or an ignorant God. Different Gnostics said different things. Sometimes this unjust, ignorant God was called Ya'aldabaoth, which I will not spell for you. Ya'aldabaoth was a misformed divine being who created this world in order to capture part of the divine and trap it here. He captured another divine being who's called Sophia, which is a Greek word for wisdom. In fact, Sophia was his own mother. He captured his mother, he divided her into a million pieces, and he trapped her in this material world. How did he trap her? By creating humankind. Human bodies are the prison for a divine element within. Some people feel like they don't really belong here. This world just doesn't make sense to them. I felt this way since the last election.
Christianity cannot claim moral superiority when its own New Testament protects slavery. Ephesians 6:5 orders enslaved people to obey their masters as they would obey Christ. 1 Peter 2:18 tells them to submit even to cruel owners. Neither passage tells Christians to end human ownership. A perfect God had space to demand obedience, but gave no clear command to abolish slavery. That failure exposes the Bible as a product of ancient culture, not timeless moral truth.
I just live in an alternative universe, and things that make sense to the majority of my compatriots just don't make sense to me, and I don't understand, and it just doesn't work for me anymore. And so I just feel like I don't belong. Why is it that some people really don't feel like they belong? Because some people don't belong here. They originated in heaven, and they've been trapped here. Trapped in the material body, they've forgotten their true origin, and they need to escape. They need to acquire the knowledge necessary for salvation. How can they get this secret knowledge, though? It's not open to just anybody, because not everybody has the spark within. Only some people have the divine spark. How do you get the secret knowledge that can set you free if you don't belong here? Somebody has to come from the divine realm and come down and reveal the truth to you. Well, who is this one who reveals the truth that will bring liberation from your imprisonment? For Gnostics, the one who reveals the truth is Jesus Christ. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Jesus is not a human being, or if he is a human being for some Gnostics, he's a human that a divine element comes into and inhabits temporarily in order to reveal the truth. This truth gets revealed to his disciples, Jesus' disciples. He teaches the crowds publicly in parables, but that's just the public stuff. What he really teaches his disciples is a secret knowledge, and they pass this along by word of mouth. the secret knowledge that can set you free. Well, what is that secret knowledge? What do you need to know? Well, this is only for the insiders. So if I were more sure of more of you, I might tell you. But as it is, I do have my doubts. So buy me a drink afterwards. This secret knowledge can set you free. Many Gnostics then thought that Jesus was actually two things, a human being, Jesus, and a divine element, Christ. They had books that supported their points of view, books that they claimed were written by apostles, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, all books discovered in fairly recent times, which reveal to us what these Gnostics were saying, including the books of the Nag Hammadi Library, which are a collection of 52 documents found in these 14 leather-bound volumes, which were written by Gnostics and for Gnostics to reveal Gnostic knowledge. You can buy these books, by the way, in English translation today. Somebody just was showing me a copy they brought with them tonight. They're available in English translation. If you want to read them, they're really very interesting. The book is called the Nag Hammadi Library in English, so you can get a sense of what these Gnostics were all about. Those then are three groups of Christians in early Christianity. Let me talk about a fourth group, the victorious party, which most people simply call the Orthodox group. As I pointed out earlier, though, it's a little bit problematic using the term Orthodox because Orthodox means that these people are right. And I'm not taking a stand on whether they were right or not. I'm simply saying that they were the group that won out. The victorious party stood over against the Ebionites, the Marcionites, the Gnostics, and other Christian groups that were around in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The victorious party had very set beliefs and authorities. In terms of their beliefs, they disagreed with the Ebionites that Jesus was human but not divine. They said, no, he's also divine. But they disagreed with the Marcionites who said he's divine but not human, because no, he's also human. Because they were fighting both things at once, they were kind of caught in the middle. And they ended up saying, yes, he's fully human. Yes, he's fully divine. And to the Gnostics, they said, but he's not two beings, he's one being. Fully human, fully divine, one being, not two. Thus developed the paradoxical Christology of the victorious group, that Jesus is both a man and God simultaneously. This, of course, is what ultimately leads to the doctrine of the Trinity. The way the doctrine of the Trinity develops, the doctrine of the Trinity is that the Godhead is in three persons. There are three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, who are all the one God. But it's not that there are three gods. There's only one God, but God is manifest in three persons who are distinct from one another. So there's not just one God. There is just one God, but there are three persons, all of whom are equally and completely God. Well, how does that work exactly? Well, Christians were driven to this point of view because they wanted to insist that Jesus was divine. And they wanted to insist that they were monotheists. And then what do you do about the Spirit, who is also portrayed as divine in Scripture? Well, you come up with the doctrine of a Trinity, and you call it a mystery, which means you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, you've got it wrong. So it's a Christian mystery, which is it's a serious theological term, mystery, because in fact this is deep, heady stuff that gets developed. That comes out of these debates about who Jesus really is. They understand then that Jesus is one being. They understand that God is the God who created this world, and there's only one God. There aren't 30 gods like in some Gnostic systems, or 12 gods. There are not two gods like there are for Marcion. There's only one God, and the God of the Old Testament is the same God as the God of the New Testament. Jesus represented the God who created this world. Paul represented the God who created this world. There's only one God who's to be worshiped and adored. There's one God, Jesus is his son. Jesus brings salvation not by delivering secret knowledge to those who are simply insiders. Jesus gives salvation to everybody by dying on the cross. It's the death of Jesus that brings salvation for the world. It's his real death. It wasn't an imaginary death, as Marcion may have thought. It was a real death. And it was precisely that death that brought about salvation, not the delivery of secret teachings. So these are some of the beliefs of the group that we might want to call the Orthodox. If you call them Orthodox, what you really are saying is that they're the group that ended up winning. Well, how did they end up winning? Why did this group emerge as victorious versus the other groups? There were a lot of disputes in early Christianity between these different groups. For centuries, we only had one side of the argument, because the Orthodox group that won these debates, after they won the debates, they rewrote the history of the engagement, so that all that survived were the histories written by the Orthodox people. And what they said in their own historical sketches, what they said was that they had always been in the majority, that the heretics were always just small minority little groups who never had any big impact at all, who were just little pestiferous mosquitoes that got swatted on occasion, and that the Orthodox had always been in the majority and had always been right.
The New Testament never clearly says that God is three equal persons. The Creed from Nicaea in 325 barely explained the Holy Spirit. Church leaders expanded the doctrine at Constantinople in 381. Even the famous Trinitarian wording in 1 John 5:7 entered the Greek text through a very late manuscript. A message from a perfect God should not require counsels and copied-in words to explain who God is. If Christianity began with one clear truth, why did believers need centuries to decide who Jesus and God were? Share your answer in the comments. Like this video and subscribe for more. Comment more Ehrman if you want us to continue exposing the lost history of Christianity.